Hello, everybody. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about episode number 2 of Hitler's Circle of Evil, Regrouping. Before I get into it, I want to address two things before I forget. The first one is the homosexuality bent that the historians try to give in this series, or insofar as episode 1 and especially 2, where they basically mention that a lot of the relationships Hitler had with his henchmen or his inner circle were homoerotic, or were basically like, for instance, there's a moment where they talk about Goebbels, because Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, I think that's how you pronounce it, Goebbels, comes into the picture, and they discuss how Goebbels basically falls in love with Hitler, and that they're not exaggerating when they say this. So I agree that these were horrible people, but I also think that you shouldn't really be making things up, right? Especially if there's no evidence to back it up. There was a sycophant element to it, there was a fanatic element to it. I understand that, but these were all people that were working, right? So you need to, like they talk about the discipline that Hitler had, or the Nazi party, or, the fact that he was able to be that resilient to not give up, especially after the first episode where we saw that there was a failed coup, right? A failed putsch, as they call it. Also, this idea of Goering, I want to talk about this specifically, where, yeah, push, a violent attempt to overthrow a government. I want to push. I want to talk about when they mention how Goering comes back. So Goering, as if you saw episode 1 or my review of episode 1, basically after the coup attempt, or the putsch failed, the failed putsch in 1923, where they tried to overtake the government in Munich, in the barbarian state, Hitler and the Nazi party, right? The group is disintegrated, right? But as they say, it doesn't collapse. So it's still there. But Goering basically takes off, and he gets shot. So he's in pain, and he starts consuming like drugs. Specifically, I think, well, I'll get into that, morphine. And then, as the Nazi party starts to gain momentum towards the 1928 election, the historians talk about how Goering is able to come back because of I think he's the prime minister of the Weimar Republic, President Hindenburg, for President Hindenburg's 80th birthday. They give an amnesty to the people that were basically that did bad things. So Goering is pardoned. He comes back, and they say this. The historians say he came back to a little bit of a frosty welcome. Like, they didn't really want him there. But then all of a sudden they saw how invaluable or valuable. I don't understand this. Is it invaluable? How invaluable a person is, or how valuable a person is? Like, what's the difference between those two, right? But anyway, they mentioned how invaluable he was. And then, he had the contacts with the power brokers, the German power brokers and the elite. So they needed his contacts and his connections. But yeah, they basically say that he got a frosty welcome, that they didn't really want him, but then they did. And it just jumps from they didn't want him to they did, just like that. So I think the fact that they say that they didn't want him is a lie, right? Because there's no evidence. It's just like throwing shade and shit at all these guys, right? Where, again, there are things that they did bad, but you can't just let your prejudices show and your biases just because you despise these people, right? Like, if he didn't get a frosty welcome and you have no evidence to back that up, or you don't mention it, then why are you even mentioning it, right? Well, anyway, that is my problem with this, with the beginning of with these 2 episodes so far. Yeah, so that was the one thing I wanted to discuss. And the other thing I wanted to discuss, which for me, the first episode basically talks about the years after, at the end of World War I, 1917, 1918, all the way to the failed coup attempt in 1923. They call it a putsch in the series, in the documentary, but I'm going to call it a coup, right? Because it's like the same thing, coup d'etat. But anyway, second episode, basically covers 5 years, which are from 1923 all the way to the elections in 1928. Well, actually, all the way to October 29th, 1929, which is when the stock exchange crashes, right? Black Friday, I think, or something like that in the United States. And my problem with this also was they don't mention, they talk about how the SS is built up, how they use mass propaganda, lorries with leaflets, pumping leaflets out into the public, all these public speeches, the uniforms of the SS designed by Nazi party member Hugo Boss and all these things. And I'm just like, whoa, 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 like, how are you guys getting all this money? Who's funding this? And then it's kind of interesting because in the design of the SS uniforms, which are like all black, the elite unit of the Nazi party, Hitler's protective force, um, there's a skull and cross and bones, right? And skull and bones is an Illuminati Freemason symbol. So, and then this goes back to like Eckhart, and, it makes me wonder how much of Freemasons or Illuminatis were actually involved in the making of the Nazi party, right? Because the Freemasons, we like to think of them as these people that rule the world. But if you really look at history, they fought each other in wars, right? Like there's been Freemasons that have been in all sides of history, right? Good, bad, wrong, right, whatever, right? So, yeah, I'm thinking that they probably got funded by some type of elite people. Anyway, I asked ChatGPT, and this is what it told me, that they charge membership fees and donations from supporters, that they did fundraising events, especially after Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Hitler's autobiography, got published in 1925. There was support from business interests, especially right-wing, anti-Marxist, and anti-communist, and national people, right? And publishing and propaganda. So they were big with the newspaper. So maybe that's how they got money. Yeah, it says here the party's newspaper, Volkischer Beobachter, was a significant source of income. It was purchased in 1920 with funds from wealthy backers and continued to generate revenue through sales and subscriptions, okay, spreading Nazi propaganda and attracting further support. Hitler's personal finances, royalty from the sales of Mein Kampf, and income from public speaking engagements, support from ex-military networks, and foreign fund, particularly anti-communist groups. So I guess this is where they were getting their money from. But anyway, after these 2 points, let's get into the analysis or the review. This is more of a review. I mean, if I were to analyze it deeply, I would talk about my ideas, but I'm just going to discuss the general breakdown of the episode. So it starts off with after the failed push or the coup, and we're now in the winter of 1923. Rudolf Hess is also thrown behind bars, so he's in prison. He tries to flee. Hitler also escapes for like 2 days, but then he gets arrested and sent to jail. Goering turns to drugs. He's in Austria and he's injured. Himmler goes back, like I had mentioned in episode 1, he goes back to live with his parents. They talk about Rudolf Hess, how he doesn't actually have love for the movement, but more for Hitler. Like he's like basically devoted to Hitler, right? So he's like his secretary or like his right-hand man at that point. And they did talk about this in episode 1, how he becomes his first disciple, which he actually does in jail because they're both in jail together. And they basically write My Struggle. So Hess is like the co-author. Okay, but we'll get into that. Röhm is labeled as a terrorist. So Ernst Röhm was the military branch arm of the Nazi party along with Goering. But this guy's more like unhinged, right? Himmler visits him, right? But basically there's nothing going on at this point. And then Joseph Goebbels comes into the picture. Now, Joseph Goebbels was in, I think, Rhineland at this point. He's young, like Himmler, and he's a PhD graduate. And in his diary, he writes, just basically another push, like another attempt to overthrow the government. He writes that about the 1923 coup d'etat attempt to overthrow the Munich government by the Nazi party and Hitler, right? So he's not really into them. He's not really like there at this point, right? Hitler is depressed, and then February 1924 comes around, which I think is a few months after his arrest, and Hitler just goes on the offensive. He starts attacking like politically. It says that he launches into discourse in courts. He gets applause from people, and he makes the headlines, right? So he's like trying to, rise from the ashes. He's trying to like come back. I think he's 34 at this point, 35, something like that. And he is actually able to appeal to the emotion and the sympathy of like the judges, right, of the courtroom, and he's given a 5-year sentence. Right now, like these people basically here at this point were labeled like terrorists because of what they attempted to do, and it would be like treason or betrayal to the government. But he's given a light sentence, um, and yeah, he ends up serving 9 months out of the 5 years that he's supposed to be there for like good behavior or something like that. And then Goebbels starts getting interested in Hitler when he starts reading the transcripts, the trial transcripts, so what he's talking about. Now, this is because Goebbels is an aspiring journalist, right? He wants to like write for newspapers, and this is kind of like the shade that they also throw at these types of people like Himmler. Himmler wanted to be a soldier, so they kind of insinuate that he's a wannabe soldier, and that's why he takes charge of the SS. And how Goebbels is a wannabe journalist, and he eventually starts like writing for a newspaper, but he's not really a journalist, like a real journalist. I don't know, just because he's a bad guy, he's not a real journalist. I mean, I understand the Himmler thing because he hasn't been in war, but and he's only head of the SS. But Goebbels, I mean, if he's writing, he's a PhD. What more do you want, right? Maybe just because he's handling a Nazi newspaper, he's not a real journalist, or I don't know if he didn't follow the criteria that real journalists have to be following. But he's also anti-Semitist, so he hates Jewish people. And Goebbels is inspired by March 1924 with the idea. So for me, I was kind of like, is this like a new Eckhart? Because he's a writer, just like Eckhart, right? And but then eventually he gets into public speaking, which is interesting because he's like that hybrid between Hitler and Eckhart, right? Like he's good at writing, but he's also good at public speaking, and he fuses those two together, which is kind of interesting. Rome is also found guilty, but he's released the same day Hitler comes down. They just say he comes down. I'm like, comes down where? Comes down to the prison, or he starts serving his sentence? They just say comes down. Hitler then asks Rome to build the SA, which is the military, the paramilitary unit of the Nazi party. But Goering is still the leader. So then Rome visits Goering in Austria, and Goering is like all drugged up off, what had I mentioned? Morphine. He's taking morphine. So he's like, whatever, take the paramilitary unit, like I don't even care. And then Rome goes back to Bavaria, and he takes charge of it, but he changes the name from the SA to the Frontbahn, right? In this case, it's the Frontbahn, which like some of those people will eventually become part of the SS, but that's later on with Himmler. And while he's in prison, Hitler has these extended privileges in the prison called Landsberg prison. And this is due to his elite admirers. So this is kind of where, it makes me think about these like people in history, how they talk about their great feats or whatever they did, historic events, but they never mention how they got it done, like financially, money wise. How did they get it done? I mean, Hitler was probably backed up by elite people. I'm thinking elite admirers, Freemasons, wealthy people, right, that were like fueling the cause, right? And Hitler was obviously at the forefront of all this, along with his henchmen and all these other guys, which the series talks about. So Rudolf Hess is in prison with Hitler. He gets 18 months for the attempted coup, and he becomes like his secretary. Rudolf Hess was an intelligence officer, which is kind of interesting, and so they kind of insinuate that he starts manipulating Hitler like from an emotional standpoint, but also from an ideological, mental perspective, which I thought was interesting. Um, and yeah, he's there for 18 months with Hitler. And then Hess inspires Hitler. They talk about the national problem, which I guess is all this like populist rhetoric, excuse me, having to do with like minority groups, the communists, after World War One, Germany being in debt and basically being punished severely, not having control of their own economy, things like that. Um, and how there's like a communist Berlin, I guess, since then, or there are communists in Berlin, something like that, which I thought was also interesting because then this would precede world at the end of World War II, which is like when Russia got in there. And they talk about how Germany wanted to expand east, not west, east, like towards Russia, and that's what Hitler attempts to do during World War II, right? He attempts to take Russia, right, which he doesn't succeed in because of the winters, but he almost did, right? Okay, so then they talk about Karl Haushofer, which was Hess's tutor, and they talk about how he has this sort of like esoteric geopolitical bent to him, like ideas. And he has this idea that Germany has a destiny and a right. They call it the Lebensraum, which is living space, for Germany to become like a Germanic superpower, super state to the east, right? And this is that idea of them traveling there. So Hess, along with Karl Haushofer's ideas, influenced Hitler while he's in prison, while Rudolf Hess, I was going to say Hermann Hess, but while Rudolf Hess and Hitler are in prison. And then Hess inspires Hitler to write down his vision for Germany. So this is when he writes Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, right? And Hess takes no credit for the book, right? So this is like when he becomes, they say this is when he like officially, I guess, becomes his first disciple, right? Like now it's for real. Like he's there supporting Hitler all the way. Goering is back in Austria doing really bad, just like after World War One. He's addicted to morphine. He blames the Jewish, for things. Oh no, this is Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, I got the notes mixed up. In Mein Kampf, Hitler blames Jewish, the Allies. He talks about the biology of races, right, which Hermann Hesse co-authors. And back to Goering. Goering is just an addict at this point. He's kind of like where he was after World War One, disappointed, right, just kind of hanging out there in Austria until he comes back towards the end of the episode. Now Rome wants to build the SA. He's building the SA, which is the Front Bond at this point, and it has 30,000 members up to this point. It's basically a private army. And Hitler realizes, though, at this point that, they talk about this, how his greatest feat from prison is not his book, My Struggle, but it's actually the realization that he had that he's not going to take control of Germany or power by physical, blunt, brute force. He has to get political. He has to become legit. He has to do things legally through elections, through democratic elections, things like that. So he realizes that the way to power is through the ballot box, right? Rome visits Hitler, and Rome is like the military guy with the weapons and stuff. And Rome and Hitler don't see eye to eye. They're basically like, they have contrasting ideas, because for Rome thinks that the only way to take power is through a coup d'etat, through a revolution blow, right? Like physically taking power, right? And Hitler at this point, he's kind of like, nah. Plus, the Front Bond is doing crimes, right? They call them the brown shirts or the thugs, and they're just going around city, causing mayhem and chaos. So Hitler doesn't want to be associated with them, and he actually resigns from the Nazi Party in July of 1924. And along with Hess, he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna play the long game. I'm in prison right now. I need to get paroled first, get out of prison, right? But just the fact that after their attempted coup, like all these guys are still, very much motivated to do what they wanted to do. That's crazy. It's like, you guys failed in 1923. How are you, a year later, how are you making power moves like resigning from the Nazi party strategically, to come back? Like, that's just crazy. Anybody else, I think, would have given up. So they say the party is fragmented, but it doesn't collapse. It's not collapsed. Himmler is still also very much active, and he wants to reintegrate himself. Right? Hitler is that young man who wanted to be a soldier, who went back to live with his parents. They consider him as smart and a backroom boy, a can-do person, a guy that gets the job done. So they say in a room full of hotheads, right, the Nazi party members, Himmler's like the guy that's conscientious and is able to get things done, right, is able to detect how to get things done and actually gets them done. And he meets the local barbarian Nazi chief, who is Gregor Strasser. And Gregor Strasser, after Hitler resigns, Gregor Strasser actually becomes the new leader of the Nazi party, and Himmler is his deputy, right? So he's right there alongside the new leader of the Nazi party, just so you can see how much Himmler's involvement is. And I think at this point he's like 24 years old. So is Goebbels. Goebbels is like in his 20s. Both of these guys are in their 20s. So, they're taking on, like, they say they're very like motivated, very ambitious people, right? Because they're so young, and then they're, in positions of like high authority and high power within the Nazi party. So Himmler they say he keeps a foot on the door in the Nazi party, while also getting connections that he's later going to need down the line, right? And I think they talk about his henchmen, all these guys, Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, but there were more people there, right? There are a lot of people, like the power brokers, they say, the elitist groups, the people with money, the people with connections of connections, like there had to be like a lot of people involved in order for all of this to take off. And they say that he was the de facto leader, which is like not the unofficial leader, even though the official leader was Gregor Strasser. They say he's the de facto leader in Lower Bavaria. So this is where I'm kind of like, okay, and then Bavaria, once again, as I mentioned in episode 1 review, the Illuminati of Bavaria, that's where Adam founded the first Illuminati sect, right, of its time in 1776. May 1st, 1776, I think, Adam Shah something founded the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Illuminati of Bavaria. So I think Bavaria has like, history. It's got to have history there. And again, maybe the Illuminati were involved in this case. Makes me think a lot about that. They talk about how Goebbels, he had a permanent disability and would limp, and how he has a big ego, and how he was not only physically crippled, but he was also emotionally crippled. They just throw a lot of shade at these guys at this point, the historians. And then in Weimar, Goebbels attends his first his first right-wing rally, and they talk about how, this is where like the Nazi propaganda. So these rallies are very much, they're like a local example, I guess, of how the party would eventually become. Right, the party would eventually become like a mass propaganda machine. And Goebbels in Weimar, which is a city in Germany, Goebbels basically attends his first right-wing meeting or right-wing rally. And the thing that we have to know about the Nazis is that they were huge on propaganda, right? They were huge on basically collective media persuasion, and they were able to effectively use propaganda, like a lot of different elements of influence. And I'm going to get into some of them right now, because actually they were saying how these right-wing rallies have a lot of the elements that would eventually become part of what we have seen in footage of the Nazi movement and the Nazi party. So some of these things are flags, banners, marching, chanting, singing, delivery of long speeches with people with a very enthusiastic audience, violence. So they would beat up passerbyers, I guess, or people that were opposing them, and drinking at the end of the day, like in the afternoon, and a lot of like camaraderie. So a lot of these events took place actually like around drinking, around bars. Some of the historians would even say like, yeah, the Nazis were a couple of guys who would just like uh, get like they would get together in bars, and that's where basically they would like give their speeches and talk. And this reminded me of the people from the Middle East. I guess they say that they're also very fiery with their speeches. So you talk to one of them, and then they'll rant for a couple of hours, even on different topics, right? Like they have that capacity to do that, which I think is a very good tool to use when you're trying to influence other people, when you're trying to get your message across, right? And we're talking about the 1920s in Germany. So you could say, well, nowadays, if I want to influence people, I could use propaganda, I can use marketing. Yes, but the problem nowadays is that everything is marketed, everything is propaganda. So you're constantly bombarded with propaganda, and it works because, a lot of people may say that doesn't work, but it works because you become familiar with it, right? Like, let's say you see some product or some service being marketed. At first, you're going to say, like, what the hell is this? But then around the fifth or 10th or 15th time you see it, you become familiar with it. And just that familiarity is enough to have a psychological impact in you where you actually develop a sort of trust with no obvious foundation, with no evidence. Obviously, you just because you're seeing it, right? Like kind of like when you start to see a person at work or at school constantly, and you just become familiar with that person, and then eventually you think you can trust that person just because you see them often, right? That's kind of how marketing works. Also, and I've spoken on this, when you need something, like let's say you need a shampoo related to whatever function or whatever you need it for. You're gonna think of the market, or you're gonna think of the brand that's been marketed a lot to you, right? So I thought this was interesting, because there's a lot of elements here to use to persuade, that I guess Goebbels eventually ends up. I don't know if he learned them from here, but I mean, he was into writing and journaling, so I think he may have known about this. That may actually be a good field to get into if you want to be persuasive, like journaling, like looking for the right words, the right way to present things. And I'm going to get into Goebbels in a little bit because he did a lot of crazy things, interesting things too. But his main weapon is language. So that's what they say. He's going to ultimately use language, right? Goebbels gets a job at a struggling newspaper, and he becomes a journalist. And this is one of those moments where some of the historians are like, and he thought he had a job. And I was like, well, no, I mean, just because you hate the guy or you hate what the Nazi party did doesn't take away the fact that he had a job, as a journalist, because maybe he's writing hateful speeches or hateful articles or whatever. But I mean, he's maybe he's not reporting accurately, right, as a journalist should. He's obviously biased, so maybe that's what they were talking about. But it's not clear. See, when they say these things, it's not clear what they're referring to. So that's kind of where I'm lost. So then they talk about how he could work a crowd. So I guess he eventually starts to give speeches, public speeches. He notices he's good at them because people are cheering him on, egging him on. And he combines, this is the moment I spoke about earlier, where he combines his writing skills with his speaking skills, right? So he combines his journalistic abilities with public speaking. And he was good at public speaking like Hitler, and he gets a reputation within a few weeks. So basically he like starts to rise through the ranks of the Nazi party, right? On December 20th, 1924, Hitler leaves jail after 9 months of serving. After serving 9 months of a 5-year sentence, and they were saying how this should have been like a memorable moment after their failed attempt, and how the Nazi party is very interesting. How despite Hitler being in jail and resigning in the 1920s and 1924 from the Nazi Party, the Nazi Party is still very much alive, right? It's in government already, even though they're saying that there aren't a lot of people in government, but it's still very much active despite Hitler not even being there or leading them, right? So this just talks about like the sentiment, the general sentiment, right? It's not like Hitler tricked or fooled a whole country or a whole people. Like, there were already a lot of people that were, there to begin with. Okay, and then on December 20th, 1924, Hitler leaves jail after having served just 9 months of a 5-year sentence. And they were expecting this moment to be glorious because of the attempted coup that had happened and the fact that the Nazi Party was still very much alive. But sadly, nobody's there to meet him. It's just him and a single car. I think there's even like a picture of him getting picked up from jail. And nobody's basically there to throw him like a parade or anything like that, which I thought was kind of weird. But anyway, the Weimar Republic at that time is becoming more stable. The Nazis take 3% of the vote in the 1924 elections. I guess Germany was having elections every 4 years or something like that. And the Nazi decides to enter politics, and they say we must enter politics legally. Now, Rome is convinced here to work with Hitler, but at this stage in 1924, Germany's basically having like a period of prosperity. So like it's all good in the hood, everyone's doing good. There really isn't much like sentiment for revolution or for change, so everything's going pretty good. Even though Rome has thousands of followers, the military general, Hitler addresses this on April 16, 1925 with Rome, stating that they will look legit legally, but Rome also wants to do a push. He wants to do a coup, another like revolution blow, right? And the relationship basically breaks down. They say it's a dangerous moment because Rome has all these men at his disposal. He basically has an army, a private army. But Rome eventually backs down. He basically, like, I guess he doesn't listen to Hitler, but he's just like, okay, you win, Hitler. The next day, Rome resigns, and but he wants to stay like friends with Hitler. And then they say in the documentary, which I thought was kind of funny, they say Hitler doesn't reply, so he just leaves him unseen, I guess. And then Rome goes to Bolivia because he wants to go and be at the other end of the world, I guess. So he just totally leaves for South America. I don't know what that relationship was between the Germans or the Nazis and South America, because I know some of them fled to South America after World War II, right? So I don't know what the connection was there or why South America. But yeah, he ends up leaving. And at this point of the episode, Hitler, they say he gets a makeover. So they're trying to decide which style he should go with. And they end up choosing the technocrat style, which is like him basically dressed up in a suit, like black suit, and basically how we see him or how we know of him today, right? But I guess this was all carefully crafted for his image, even though he's still not allowed to give public speeches because of his jail sentence and his parole conditions. So in 1925, the Nazi ban is lifted on the party and newspaper, but Hitler cannot speak in public until 1927. So then Goebbels joins, and Goebbels kind of becomes like the mouthpiece for the Nazi party while Hitler still can't do public speeches, right? Goebbels believes in the socialist Marxist philosophy of the class struggle. So he's actually the one that brings in the socialist perspective into the Nazi party. And Goebbels actually joins in Rhineland, which is away from Munich, and he continues to do public speeches all across Germany. So he really goes hard in this sense. Like he basically starts giving speeches all over Germany all the time. They say that he gave 189 speeches in 12 months, which is an insane amount, right? That's probably a speech every other day or something like that, every third day. Um, and in July 12, 1925, Hitler breaks the ban and Goebbels is there. And this is like another part where they say Goebbels falls in love with Hitler, right? Like as if there was like a homosexual tendency there or something like that. Goebbels shakes his hand, right? But Hitler still doesn't really know who he is, even though a lot of people know who Goebbels is at this point because he's given a lot of speeches. Goebbels basically wants in and he starts to become like vital for the Nazi party, right? Um, and they also mention how authorities basically ignore like Hitler's local speeches because even though he has a ban, he's still giving speeches like here and there, right? Um, but if he were to go nationwide, then he would get arrested. So this is the moment where they say we need a new face, and Goebbels will be the new face, the new mouthpiece of the Nazi party. Um, Hitler brings Goebbels in basically, and Goebbels is sent to Berlin, to the capital, where the capital basically at this point has a left wing stronghold. And if we think about it in terms of right wing and left wing, we can see that the Weimar Republic was left wing oriented and the Nazi party was right wing oriented, right? So whenever you have a right wing ideology is because there's a crisis, because, right, that's where martial law comes in. When there's a crisis, so all this right wing ideology, defending ourselves, protection, survival, all of those things come in when they're needed, right? But when everything is prospering and everything, you can have a more lenient left wing, liberal government, right? So Goebbels sets order in Berlin because Berlin did have Nazi members, but I guess there was like infighting and there was like chaos over there in Berlin. So Goebbels goes there and he sets order to Berlin. And they basically talk about how he turns like a wedding or a funeral or even a rally into a Nazi event, right? He turns them into like events by, using lorries to, deliver leaflets. He uses posters. He has the newspaper, which is called The Attack in Berlin. And he also uses public speaking, of course. And Goebbels starts fighting the communists in Berlin. So the communist thing is so interesting because, like I mentioned, it basically talks about how there were already, infighting with the communists before it becomes like a thing in Berlin, right? So I wonder what other European countries had this, like, fight with the communists, like even before communism was a thing in the 50s and the 60s, right? Okay, so he does all this and he fights, like physically, he fights the communists. He spills blood to provoke opposition parties, right? And there's this idea that, like, if Goebbels was going to be there, then you were going to be entertained, right? Because I guess he was like good at this. He was a good propagandist or a good marketer, basically. Excuse me. Okay, so by 1926, while Goebbels is doing all this, Hitler and Rudolf Hess, I get confused with Hermann Hess, but Rudolf Hess both of them have made very little leeway, and they relaunched the party. And then there's a new protection force with Himmler, and this is when they talk about the Schutzstaffel, the SS, basically the one we all know, which is an elite unit, a local elite unit. Who's there for protection of Hitler, right? Now the SS is made up of mostly SA soldiers, which were Göring soldiers, right? But in Lower Bavaria, Himmler is looking for specific type of people, right? Which this is where the racism basically comes in. And he handpicked people based on their physical appearance, right? And not only that, they need to trace their ancestry back to the 18th century, right? So he's really like, I guess, like demanding of who joins this elite SS unit. And this is the part where I spoke about, this was like mind-boggling for me because they're talking about the uniforms and Hugo Boss makes them, and I was like, how do they get the money for all of this? Who's funding all of this, right? They talk about the uniform and the Tutankoft. I think it's Tutankoft. The uniforms designed by Hugo Boss, which have the skulls and cross and bones on them, which to me are completely Illuminati, Freemason stuff. And the SS objective is basically to defend Hitler, right? Now, they talk about this at this moment of the episode, how each person is like strategically in their place. Rudolf Hess is managing the day-to-day policies and basically like operations, party matters, right? Goebbels is the mouthpiece, and Himmler has the SS, the police force for the Nazis. And then at this point, they get into talking about how Himmler and Himmler and Goebbels are like very similar. They're very similar because they're both young and they know of each other and they kind of respect each other. They're cool with each other because I guess later on there's gonna be like infighting, but at this point they're like cool with each other. They respect the efficiency of the other person, right, to get things done. On March 5th, 1927, Hitler's ban on public speaking is lifted, and he starts, giving very populist speeches like Germany must take back financial control, right? We must have internal control, not from the exterior, from the allies, things like that, right? But they also need the power brokers, right? The people with power in Germany, which Goering would take care of this, right? The fighter pilot hero. He had those connections. He has those connections, but since he's still in Austria, right? The Nazi Party doesn't have those connections. So then this is when they talk about President Hindenburg's 80th birthday, and he gives an amnesty for all these people, including Goering. Goering takes it, and he comes back in 1927. And this is the part where I spoke about earlier in the video, how they say he comes back to a frosty welcome, and it's like, well, what's the evidence for that, right? Because eventually he starts marketing himself as ambassador to the Nazi Party because he's very social. He has all these connections, these skills, right? These social skills. So he starts doing that like basically as soon as he returns. So I don't know where the frosty welcome is. If you do, let me know in the comments. And yeah, so after this, in 1928, there are the national elections. So this episode, like I mentioned, basically covers from 1923 to 1928, 5 years. And the first episode covered like 5-6 years too. So each episode, I don't think it covers 5 years, or maybe it does. I don't know. But yeah, this is a lot of information for this second episode. And they basically say there's disaster because the mood was off, right? The Nazi Party only gets 2.6% of the national vote, so nowhere near half or close. And even in Berlin, Goebbels doesn't achieve the majority party. They only get 12 out of 500 seats in parliamentary or the Senate, I think. And then Goebbels and Göring are the only people from the Nazi Party that become members of parliament. And they're basically talking about how they need a crisis. They need something to, basically set their movement off, because at this point the Nazi Party was all about taking back control and power and change and the populist appeal. But Germany was doing fine, so they didn't really need change. People weren't going to risk a better future for what they had, which was good at that time, I guess. 10 years after World War I guess they were in a good place. Even before that, 5 years into past World War I, they were good. So they talk about how they need a crisis, and then there's a miracle that happens, which is on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashes in the United States. So, and then they say how Hitler was the only one that predicted, or the Nazi Party was the only one that predicted this, right? So I guess this is like a key pivotal moment, because all the work that they have done up to now to get in position to strategically place different members in strategically different areas, the best of the best in different positions. And but the timing is off. Timing is very important, especially with these things. So then that happens, and when the United States stock market crashes, I think Black Monday, right, is the term, or something like that. I said Black Friday earlier, but I think it's Black Monday. um, Germany's affected. So now all of a sudden, all that prosperity in Germany gets flipped on its head, gets turned upside down. And, that's probably where episode 3 is going to pick up on. That's probably where people are going to be angry. They're going to want change. And then I recall the Nazi party enters in 1932, 1933, something like that. So that would be maybe around those elections. So that's really when things are going to pick up. And yeah, so we'll get into like basically right before the Nazi party enters power in the next episode, I'm thinking. So let me know what you thought about this review. And that's all I got for this video. So I'll see you in the next one. All right. Peace.